then national security analyst and expert and retired Marine intelligence officer Hal Kempfer. He joins me. Hal, thanks for being with us here on this Friday. We want to get into so much of these particulars here. I want to put up this tweet. Alex Hogan referenced this in her report, Hal. Netanyahu responded to the White House saying, quote, "I'm willing to absorb personal attacks if that is what it takes for Israel to get the arms and ammunition it needs in its war for survival." Hal, you and I believe, had a segment on this flare-up amongst U.S.-Israeli relations. I believe that was Wednesday. And this was Netanyahu's response to some of the reporting that came out from Washington saying U.S. officials were puzzled, frustrated, thought that Netanyahu was unhinged. Well, this is Netanyahu's response to all of that. Hal.
Andrew, yes, it is interesting to see how he's turned this into a personal thing. Of course, I kind of was waiting for this. That remark about unhinged, I didn't see Netanyahu letting that go unanswered. So this is kind of his response. He's personalizing it. But, you know, I put it in context. The U.S. and certainly other countries, and to include international groups, the European Union, everybody's asking the same question, which is, what is the day after? What is the plan once regular or high intensity combat operations end? And now we have the next step, which is the IDF is asking that same question, being very accusatory. And it's a real difficult political dynamic for Netanyahu personally. He's got the Israeli Defense Forces basically publicly criticizing him and his administration for not having a comprehensive plan, which sounds exactly like what the White House is saying. So it shows the IDF and the White House literally almost linked, at least philosophically, if you will, in terms of saying, hey, look, you got to have a better plan for the day after, and talking about the long-term strategy. And then the other part is he's watching his own, his war cabinet fell apart. He's watching his own cabinet with these far-right members. And he knows that if he goes that direction as to, saying, hey, there should be a Palestinian state or setting up another Palestinian type authority, not to say the Palestinian Authority, that he's very likely to see a couple of key ministers drop out. That could cause his cabinet or his coalition to collapse, which would trigger those elections, which is what protesters are asking for. So he's got a difficult situation.
Yeah, Hal, this has been a long week because on Monday we talked about that piece of news that the Israeli war cabinet was dissolved by Benjamin Netanyahu. But let's talk about goalposts shifting on this question of completely exterminating, extirpating, whatever word you want to use, the terrorist group that is Hamas, that is in this fight with the IDF there in Gaza. In the immediate aftermath of October 7th, the United States and Israel, that was their main goal, that was their aim and message, that Hamas needs to be completely exterminated. Now, though, to your point, we have this report from Israel's Channel 13 broadcaster. They were interviewing Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari. He's somewhat of the IDF's chief spokesperson. You sent this to me. He said this: to say that we are going to make Hamas disappear is to throw sand in people's eyes. If we don't provide an alternative, in the end, we will have Hamas. That comes 2 weeks to the day President Biden was at the White House talking about this three-phase ceasefire deal that isn't really operative at this point in time, but at that very announcement of the deal, saying that how Hamas is right now, they can never perpetrate another October 7th attack on Israel. They have been degraded that much. So you have these two kind of ideas operating at the same time. One is that Hamas is so degraded, they can never do another October 7th. And two, there are going to be elements of Hamas that remain in a post-war Gaza here. I think saying the goalposts have shifted is putting it mildly, don't you think?
Andrew, I would say yes, absolutely, putting it mildly. What you've seen is, the destruction of Hamas. And then, of course, with all the controversy that's come out of this week, it's like, well, it wasn't quite saying the destruction of Hamas. And And what the Netanyahu administration has talked about is the destruction of Hamas militarily and their ability to govern or to be a government in the Gaza Strip. Well, that's a little bit different than the complete destruction. This is what Hagari was saying. And by the way, he is the chief spokesperson for the Israeli Defense Forces. He talks to the chief of staff daily of the Israeli Defense Forces. There's nobody who is a more senior voice, a more authoritative voice on what's going on in the IDF than Ramo Hagari. I mean, he is the point on this. And so when he's saying this, what he's saying is, look, it's an ideology, it's an idea, it's a political party, and you have to have something that replaces it. If you have something that replaces it, which goes back to the day after thing. It can't just be, you can't just use kinetics to solve every problem. At some point, you have to have a political alternative. That's his point. And it was interesting to see that because Netanyahu did respond by I don't know if you want to say clarifying, moving the goalposts, whatever it was, scoping in their comments, which I have to say, some of their rhetoric had been a little bit loose. All right. It had been a little all encompassing. It's like, hey, look, I've only been doing this war business for, I don't know, 4 decades or whatever. And so when I look at it, I go, yeah, that doesn't quite work that way. And by the way, the U.S. learned that the hard way in a couple of places. So more in a couple of places. So, you really have to have defined end state goals that are achieved.
Hal, so this isn't Washington and the White House saying this. This isn't London and 10 Downing Street saying this. This isn't Brussels saying this. This is the chief spokesperson of the IDF. So does it undercut any future time Bibi Netanyahu might come out and say that is still the war aim, to completely eradicate Hamas? And the timing of this, does that somewhat ordain that the war is coming to a close because these conversations are being had out in the open in Israel? Does it mean that the war is almost over and that the post-war conversation can finally happen?
I think the post-war conversation's already begun. They're down to the last 4 battalions. Now, with that said, based on what the Institute for the Study of War has looked at on most recent attacks against the IDF, their position is that those, they kind of, these IDF says 2 of the battalions are seriously degraded. Previous to that, I had seen some stuff saying they thought they were pretty much gone, and the last 2 were seriously degraded. Now there seems to be an assessment kind of going the other direction. And they said those attacks were pretty sophisticated, which shows a certain amount of unit cohesion, leadership coordination that still exists. So militarily, there still is a Hamas there. So can't say that Hamas militarily has been wiped out completely. There is more to be done there. I think the IDF is going to keep prosecuting that because I certainly don't see a ceasefire agreement popping up anytime now. So they'll keep doing that. But it still leaves the other part, which is they've said a lot of those forces have moved elsewhere in the Gaza Strip. They're now insurgent forces. They're going to keep fighting. So that goes right back to what Hagari was talking about, which is you have to have another idea. You have to have another solution. And frankly, from all indications, the Palestinian people in Gaza are pretty fed up with Hamas and everything Hamas has brought on them. But there's no alternative. That's the problem. There's nothing else.
So Hal, though, does it undercut the overall war aim if this is now an open secret that Hamas, can't be completely eradicated? I mean, how do you think Hamas takes that here? If it is now an open secret in Tel Aviv and London and D.C., does that undercut Israel's prosecution of the war?
Well, I don't know if it undercuts the prosecution of the war. It does give Hamas wind in their sails, if you will. Look, they're going to glom onto anything they think is good news or positive news or whatever underlines their original thesis that they will prevail. They're not going to prevail militarily. They will probably continue as an insurgent group up until the point that the Palestinian people in Gaza Strip have just had enough of them. But this is the thing. It's one thing to ask the Palestinian civilians to basically call the Israeli Defense Forces and tell them where tell them where Hamas forces are hidden or Hamas terrorists are hidden. If there is a viable alternative, if there is something that is seen as a legitimate representative governing authority of the Palestinian people in Gaza, that makes the prosecution of a counterinsurgency much easier, much more possible, much more plausible, particularly if it has broad regional multinational support with physical support, boots on the ground in the Gaza Strip. Then you have something. And I think that's kind of what Hagari is alluding to,
Okay.
which is you have to have that political solution.
All right, Hal Kemper, we're going to have to leave it at that. I can't thank you enough for providing all this insight into not only the war in Gaza, but the war in Ukraine this week, Hal, and we'll talk soon. Have a good weekend.
Okay, you too, Andrew.